Welcome to Stifel's Sightlines podcast, focusing each week on a topic or two important to investors. Well, greetings and welcome to the Sightlines podcast. This is Michael O'Keefe, Stifel's Chief Investment Officer. So in this episode, I want to actually jump into the upcoming U.S. elections. There's been so much obviously going on. We're really living in historic times. Sort of starting with the poor performance of President Biden at that debate with Trump, ultimately, of course, leading to his withdrawal from the race. We had that very shocking assassination attempt on President Trump. Thankfully, he survived. And now that President Biden is not seeking re-election, it seems that Vice President Kamala Harris is locking up the Democratic nomination. So again, historic times, I think. And by the way, on July 30th, it's a Tuesday at 3 p.m. Eastern, we're going to have a client webinar on this topic. So go to stifelinsights.com and you'll see a link there either to the live link on Zoom or the replay, depending on when you hit that link. And again, I invite you to check that out. In any event, let's jump into it. So, essentially, what's been notable about the patterns of what's been happening is you have something like, I think it's overall just the Republican Party slowly kind of coalescing around Trump over the last number of years. But then, honestly, that assassination attempt was sort of a crystallizing event. It sort of like pulled people together. It was right before the convention. They had a very sort of united front at the convention. And I kind of think of it as the Republican Party, therefore, sort of rallying around and sort of centering on, populism, essentially the idea that they want to appeal to the concerns, the interests of ordinary Americans rather than the quote unquote elite, and really emphasize nationalism, things like a lockdown on illegal immigration. And then from the Republicans' perspective, economic policies that in general will spur growth and protect American jobs. That's sort of the platform at its core. With all that's been happening in the Democratic Party and now the almost like the need to rally around Vice President Kamala Harris to kind of have the money to spend that's been raised by Biden, I think, to kind of compete in this election. That has sort of caused the Democratic Party to further rally around progressive values. So emphasizing things like social justice, economic equality, renewable energy, government sort of involvement, government intervention to address systemic issues and provide things like, in their ideal state, social services like universal health care, et cetera. So with all that said, when we watch the various models out there trying to gauge where things might be going, it leans Trump, thinking very round numbers 60-40. Now, I always say a 40% chance, sort of like saying there's a 40% chance of rain. Once it's raining, it's raining, right? So the 40% chance of Harris being elected is actually a big number. It tells us we can't tell for sure what's going to happen. But as of the last look at some of the predictive models, we're seeing a 38% probability of a Republican sweep. And then the next second most expected scenario is a 23% probability of a Trump win, a Republican Senate, and a Democratic House. So Congress kind of flipping. And so, again, we'll see how it all unfolds. We'll be doing more. I'm going to get, in fact, next week into the investment implications. But this week, I want to set the foundation for that, really around the platform of each party, at a high level, kind of important dimensions, right? So the first up is taxes. So just in general, Republicans favor lower taxes. Democrats will seek higher taxes to really fund the various social services and things that they want. In the case of the Republicans, at a minimum, we would expect them to extend the Tax Cut and Jobs Act from 2017, those rates forward, if not bring some tax rates even lower. Whereas the Democrats, they may extend some of those lower taxes for lower earners, but ultimately they've got their sights set on corporations and wealthy individuals. So think of things like corporate taxes going up, stock buyback tax going up, treatment of capital gains as ordinary income. These are all things that will be meaningful in terms of increased taxes if the Republicans are in power and are able to enact this type of legislation. In any event, so that's something that's in focus. Next up, I would say, is the relationship with China. And, right now it's essentially popular to be, quote unquote, tough on China. We've talked about that before, I think. And so, think of it as the Democrats probably maintaining status quo where the tariffs are, et cetera, but maybe with a leaning towards creating better American competition in the world of, let's say, electric vehicles, for example. So EVs. But with former President Trump, he's basically signaling a trade deal with China, or quote unquote, that would boost tariffs quite significantly. And so that's sort of his way of thinking is, hey, if we're gonna buy goods and services, we're gonna essentially charge a tariff in terms of stuff coming into our country. So that's sort of a protectionist mindset, right? And I would say, generally speaking, both parties have a protectionist mindset, but the Republicans, of course, are very focused on illegal immigration. So we would expect to see an aggressive clampdown on that, and a real focus on our southern border. On the Democratic side, essentially it's going to be a little bit more about trying to help people. So think refugee resettlements, think pathways for illegal immigrants to gain legal status, et cetera. So, I think they recognize that illegal immigration has gotten a little out of control, but they're going to try to rein it in, just not aggressively as the Republicans. In any event, next up, I would describe sort of the size of government, the complexity and volume of regulation, what that means in terms of, in some ways, government spending, but also, sort of constraints on businesses as they seek to do what they do and grow and sort of contribute to the economy. And as we know, the Republicans will really, especially Trump, will seek to meaningfully reduce the complexity and volume of regulations and shrink or even eliminate some agencies. So I know there's a lot of talk about really reducing probably the scope and scale of the Department of Interior, as an example. And so that, there's sort of like this concept that Trump has talked about, draining the swamp. In part, that's about sort of the established a government that sort of is there, whoever's in office, basically shrinking that, trying to make that more efficient. On the flip side, Democrats would have by their nature a desire to increase regulation, and we would expect two areas that will be affected will include financial services, more constraints, and sort of what would be viewed as sort of protections being implemented via regulation, as well as essentially environmental type things, so emissions. And so again, depending on who's in power, who's got control, what things can get done, that will be in focus. Now, finally, we've talked a lot about fiscal transition, the idea that interest rates are up, they're going to stay up. Even if the Fed starts cutting, they're not going to bring things down back to where they were during the pandemic, or even sort of between the pandemic and the financial crisis. And so we've got a higher cost of debt. Our government has raised a lot of debt. We've issued a lot of debt. So we have, sort of that big liability, and the cost of that debt is going up. And, the bottom line is what we would like to see is some fiscal discipline. So basically reduced deficit spending through, shrinking some of the activities. Maybe that involves increasing taxes or higher levels of taxes if the economy's cranked up a little bit. And, we're just not seeing it. We think it's sort of politically popular for this deficit spending to continue, and that's an issue that continues to a bit get kicked down the road, but it's going to need to be dealt with at some point. So listen, what I wanted to do this week was basically set that foundation. So that's a little update on kind of the state of things with the election, high level kind of framing around policy really between the two camps. Reiterate the July 30th at 3 p.m. Eastern webinar. So Brian Gardner, our Chief Washington Policy Strategist, will join me for an extended discussion on these topics. And then importantly, next week, so in our next episode, we're going to continue the discussion, but shift our views to the markets and investment opportunities. So think of it as, among other things, a breakdown of the industries or sectors that might be in or out of favor depending on how things settle with the election. So listen, thank you so much for listening to this episode, and we'll catch you next week. Thanks again for listening to Stifel's Sightlines. Be sure to subscribe wherever you're listening to automatically receive each week's podcast in your feed.